There are some images that don't simply record history, they change it. On the morning of 11th of June 1963, at a busy crossroads in Saigon in Vietnam, a Buddhist monk calmly sat down in the lotus position while fellow monks poured petrol over his robes. He struck a match, and as the flames engulfed him, he remained perfectly still. The Associated Press photographer Malcolm Browne captured the moment, and within hours the photograph had travelled around the world. For many it became the defining images of the 1960s, an image of extraordinary serenity in the midst of unimaginable violence. It shocked governments, altered international opinion about Vietnam, inspired many artists and activists, and introduced many people in the West to a very different understanding of Buddhism than the one they'd imagined. But what exactly was Thích Quảng Đức trying to achieve? Was this an act of suicide, martyrdom, compassion, or something else entirely? How can such an act be reconciled with a religion that places non-violence and the sanctity of life at the very heart of its teaching? This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen. Before we begin, I just want to say thanks to all those who've joined our Patreon, and if you haven't, a gentle invitation to do so. It's full of goodness. If you can help keep this place free from ads and hideous sponsors, which I'd like to do, and contribute, that would be great. But you can join for free and just send us your good wishes, support and suggestions. They are much appreciated. bureauoflostculture.com. Today I'm joined by Professor James Shield, one of the leading scholars of Buddhist ethics and engaged Buddhism. We're going to explore the story behind that extraordinary photograph and the context that gave rise to it. We also look at the long history of self-sacrifice in the Buddhist tradition, stretching back to ancient scriptures, and ask how these dramatic acts have been understood over the centuries. And we branch out into the wider history of self-immolation, setting yourself on fire as political protest, and ask why the deliberate sacrifice of one's own life can sometimes become one of history's most powerful forms of resistance. We also tackle one of the most challenging ethical questions of all. If Buddhism rejects both violence and suicide, how does it distinguish between self-sacrifice and self-destruction? What might it have to say about contemporary debates surrounding euthanasia and assisted dying? I have just taken part in a whole weekend of events to mark the centenary of Allen Ginsberg. Allen and many other of the Beats consider themselves at times to be Buddhists, right the way back to Jack Kerouac and On the Road and Dharma Bums. They were books that inspired me and inspired my thinking about this. And in this conversation, I learned quite a bit about protest, conscience, what it might mean to be a pacifist, and the extraordinary power a single human act can have. Let's get to it. James Shields, greetings. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
My pleasure to be here.
You're definitely a Buddhist scholar, but are you also a Buddhist?
That is a great question. I do like to think of myself as a Buddhist because I understand Buddhism broadly as being about dedication to relieving suffering as widely as possible. I have practiced in a number of traditions. I don't have a particular sectarian connection, so I wouldn't call myself Zen or anything like that. But I do like to think that I practice in my life the things that I study when it comes to especially Buddhist ethics and thinking about Buddhism in relation to politics, which is something that my work does and sometimes causes a bit of controversy, let's say, among other Buddhist studies folks who don't think Buddhism has much of a political connection.
You've written about Buddhist views on violence, self-sacrifice, which we're obviously going to come to, environmental ethics, social engagement, and of course, modern politics. Well, let's start with this image. It's 11th of June in 63. The busy Saigon intersection, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thích Quảng Đức calmly sits in the lotus position while fellow monks pour petrol over him. He lights a match. Eyewitnesses remark that he remains completely motionless throughout. And there's this American journalist, Malcolm Browne, is there, and he photographs this, right? And those images, I think it's not an exaggeration to say, is that they have become some of the most influential photographs of the 20th century. Would you think so?
I would say that's absolutely correct. President Kennedy himself said that, so we can take
Right.
take that as part of the story too. We can dive into why the photograph is so powerful, but I think one of the things is obviously the disturbing element of it, to actually watch a human being. Now, even if it's a still photograph rather than a video, but you're seeing this human being completely engulfed in flames and showing no physical reaction to that. And the eyewitnesses were, all agreed that for the entire period of his burning, there was no sound, there was no crying out, there was no obvious sense of pain, which is hard for us to comprehend.
It is, totally. I'm going to ask you more about how it might be possible for somebody to remain calm throughout, what would, for most of us, seem like an agonizing situation. Not only physically remain calm, but, be able to die like that. But this is what we call self-immolation, right, James? And I was surprised to find out this wasn't the first time. And in fact, there's a whole tradition of this, probably in other religions too, but let's stick to Buddhism, right? So it's there in the scriptures. I mean, maybe you could just walk us through some of that historical context.
Yeah, so to start there, before we get into the self-immolation, the very early Buddhist text, one of the classic texts, is called the Discourse on Burning. The Buddha speaks of how the greed, the hatred, the delusion that human beings have is a kind of burning. He uses that term. The actual root of the word nirvana, which is the term to describe liberation from suffering, literally means to blow out a flame. So there's an interesting connection there, just even in the language, that nirvana means the blowing out of a flame, meaning the flame of suffering. So suffering is imagined as a fire. Moving on in time, a later Buddhist text, the Lotus Sutra, picks up on this idea and has this very wonderful kind of parable about children playing in a house and the house being on fire, but the children are not aware of the fire, or they're too busy in their games to actually notice it. And the father, who's the Buddha, of course, coaxes them out of the house by promising them toys. And they eventually get out of the house. And that's another way of talking about the Buddha bringing you out of the fire of the world into some more peaceful state.
Was there not also a story of a bodhisattva king who burns his own body as an offering, though, as well?
That's right. Yes. And this is where the Chinese tradition emerges. It was taking some of these early, what I think are very powerful metaphorical stories, and taking them quite literally and actually putting them into practice. It wasn't always entirely self-immolation. It's often just cutting off parts of the body, or, making physical adjustments, let's say, to one's form, as a way of showing a kind of devotion and also recognizing that the body is not that significant, that the world goes long beyond our material body. Now, this was a new innovation in China, and not everyone was happy about it, especially when it got to the point of what we would call suicide, so the complete destruction of the body through fire. And the reason for that is very clear. The early texts are 100% clear that suicide is wrong. The reason suicide is wrong is because it's a kind of violence against a physical being, which is against the principle of ahimsa, or nonviolence. And even more so, I think, when you kill yourself, you limit the ability to help others. So there's that element as well. Obviously, if you're dead, you're not going to be able to practice the teachings and to help others liberate themselves. So when this arose in China, it was not 100% supported by Buddhist institutions. There was a lot of mixed feeling about it. And I think you see some of that. If I can just jump ahead a little bit, we can go back to this more. But the Dalai Lama, and the reason he talks about it is because since 2009, by far the most common Buddhist place in the Buddhist world where you have self-immolation is Tibet.
I want to come back to that, but just to loop back a little bit, and this is in the original stories, right? So before the Buddha is actually enlightened, he does try out various other things, and one of them is this kind of like extreme asceticism, right? Where he doesn't eat, he's eating like a grain of rice a day or something, and he gets incredibly thin, and he sort of has this insight that this is not going to cut it. This is not the way forward. So he explicitly rejects the idea of like asceticism. You're saying that, however, that in China, right, is that becomes this tradition of, in a way, I suppose, showing that you've gone beyond the temptations, let's sort of say, the physical desires of the body. So you're...
Yes. One of the things that develops within several hundred years of the earliest Buddhist teachings is the idea of the bodhisattva as a being who is able to actually break the Buddhist teachings in order to liberate other beings. So that's the term for that is upaya. That's the Sanskrit term. And this was in the early Buddhist tradition, upaya usually meant the Buddha adjusting his teachings depending on the audience. But what happens, especially as the Mahayana tradition develops in Buddhism, is upaya becomes something much stronger. It becomes, in some ways, a loophole, you could say, for very advanced Buddhist practitioners like bodhisattvas to actually do things like suicide or murder in some cases.
There are Buddhist practices, aren't there, where you're imagining sort of cutting yourself into bits and offering yourself. So, I don't think as, that was, hey, we're going to do that practice today. It was more like either an imaginative visualization or it's a kind of metaphor for these bodhisattva beings. They're so compassionate that they put off their own enlightenment to take these vows that they will not rest until they've saved every being. So you think, although maybe they were meant metaphorically, at times people started to take them literally.
I think that's exactly. And, again, just to be clear, it was controversial, but there was also support for these monks. So it wasn't as if the entire Buddhist establishment was saying, no, you can't do that. We only meant it metaphorically. There was a sense that this could be something that actually helped spark awakening or helped spark other beings to be liberated from sufferings.
Well, let's sort of take a massive sort of forward wind to Vietnam in the 20th century. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff happening in between then. But just set the scene. It's Vietnam. It's the beginning of the 60s. What's Vietnam like, and what's the political situation, context, if you like, that brings about this extraordinary event in 1963?
This is important, and it's complex. An interpretation that this is about the war. When really it wasn't. I mean, the war was happening. The French had been in Vietnam for about 10 years, maybe a little more, since the early 50s. And the U.S. had been supporting the French for some time. But the full-scale war, as we think about it, really isn't happening yet. So the protest was about the treatment of Buddhists in Vietnam by the president, President Diem, who was politically, I guess you would call him a conservative. He was an anti-communist. The Viet Cong had been, resisting the regime for some time. And he was also a Catholic. This is where the event really finds its source, because President Diem did a lot of things to annoy and upset the Buddhist community in Vietnam, despite the fact that roughly 80% of Vietnamese are Buddhists. And one of the things he did not long before this was he prohibited the flying of the Buddhist flag. And what precipitated the event with Thích Quảng Đức was a protest by Buddhists. It's really about broadly the mistreatment of Buddhists, and specifically about the massacre that happened during this protest against the prohibition against the Buddhist flag.
Right. So the image itself does take on a kind of life of its own sort of subsequently, doesn't it? Because even though the actual incident itself was not to do with the protests about American involvement in the Vietnamese wars, it did come to be sort of associated with that later on, right? But its genesis was a little bit earlier. But what do we know about Thích Quảng Đức himself as a monk, and what kind of life had he led?
Well, he was fairly typical, I suppose, of a lot of young Vietnamese men who become monks early on. He had entered the monastic community as a teenager, which is quite common, and had, as far as I understand, not really done very much to show that this was something that was going to happen. I mean, there wasn't a kind of inevitability to this event, but he, along with a lot of other Buddhist monks at the period, were increasingly unhappy with the treatment of Buddhists. And they decided, just to be clear, this wasn't simply him deciding this. He did this with a number of other of his colleagues. This was a staged event. I don't mean by saying that it wasn't real in some way. Of course it was real, but they identified a particular day, a particular place, and they let reporters know that something was going to happen. So the reason that Malcolm Browne and David Halberstam, for example, were there was because they had been told that something was going to happen at this place and time. So in 1963, of course, there had been television for some period before this, but in some ways, this is really at the cusp of the world that we live in today, where things become very quickly spectacles and images that can be used in various ways. So, to Thích Quảng Đức and his colleagues credit, I suppose, they realized that they could have an impact by letting these Western reporters in particular know that this was going to happen. If they had done this 20 years before, it wouldn't have had nearly the impact because probably many fewer people wouldn't have known about it.
Right. So I recently did an interview with Jason Burke on a tangentially related subject. His book, The Revolutionists, is about the, we would call them terrorists, I suppose, that came out of the counterculture. One of the main things in that is that, particularly at the beginning, our actions were really aimed at the media, rather than at punishing people, say, so the hijacking of planes, for instance, which started quite early on. The point of that was to, as Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. So, to leverage your voice, your message by creating some sort of what Jason calls like a theatrical act, effectively, a performative act.
Mm-hmm.
That because and this is an absolute classic case of that because it is a message that went out across the world, right? So within that staging, as you describe it, he chooses immolation rather than another form of protest. Was that a discussion, that like they thought, what can we do that's going to have the most impact?
I don't know if anybody knows what was happening sort of behind the scenes in terms of that decision-making process. I would think that they chose self-immolation because it is such a powerful image. I don't know, maybe the Japanese seppuku or something, putting a sword in your stomach might be equally, but there's something about that. And the fact that fire has this resonance, and as we've already discussed, this long tradition of self-immolation, even if not in Vietnam, I mean, clearly they were aware of these earlier practices in China, and also the textual practices, probably even more so than necessarily the historical ones. So I think the combination of it being so well suited, let's say, for an image, all those things put together, it's clear to me why self-immolation was the chosen method.
Obviously, the theatrical performative act is so powerful because contemporary witnesses, not only the photographers, but they describe his extraordinary composure. So how do we understand that in terms of how does one set oneself on fire with all the pain that would bring and remain in that state? Because what it communicates, I suppose, to us is that he had such a level of self-control, possibly through meditation or through Buddhist practices, that he was able to control his pain response, right? Is that it?
That's it. And, don't ask me whether I can do that. Obviously, I can't.
Can't even stick a pin in my hand that's shouting out, but...
Yeah, my threshold of pain is not long. I mean, it's an extreme example, but many studies, as you may know, have shown that meditation, especially done by Buddhists, but in theory by anyone, really does and can make a big difference in the way your brain works. And you can see this. I mean, in the last, say, 30, 40 years, they've been able to chart this using modern technology. And the evidence is fairly clear that, maybe if you do it once a week or something, it doesn't have that much of an effect. But if you're a serious meditator and you practice it in the way that these monks have been practicing it, it really can make a difference. Now, do, most monks get to that level? The answer is probably no. And so, one of the questions that I have that I'm interested in is, was he aware that he had reached that level? And I suppose at some level, maybe he was, and that's why he did it, was because he knew that the effect would be very different if he had been yelling out in pain, right? I think it would have been also very traumatic and powerful, but not in the same way that it was.
Right. And some of the self-immolations that have happened since, including some fairly recently, actually, that has not been the experience of the person that's set themselves on fire. They've obviously been experiencing a great deal of pain. And yeah, that is very dramatic. It's much more horrific. I suppose in his case, the power in the message is that he's able to do that. When I meditate, but it takes me a bit of time to sort of get comfortable and get easily distracted, right? But this is a guy who's going to sit down on a busy intersection in Saigon, right, with loads of people around already, knowing what he's going to do, and then to get super concentrated and do that. That's quite something, isn't it? Could it be conceivable then that amongst his friends, colleagues, fellow monks, that he was chosen or put himself forward because he actually had that ability, that he'd through meditation, he'd trained himself to be able to, say, withdraw from the body sensations?
I think so. I mean, that would make sense to me. But again, how do you know? It's like, it's not the kind of thing you could test, except on a much smaller scale. But I think that's probably the case, is that there was a decision made among this, relatively small group of monks that this was the person who should be doing this. And he willingly did it, to be clear. There's no evidence that he was at all coerced into this, given his public statements beforehand and so on.
And if he'd been coerced, there's no way that he would have been able to respond so calmly anyway, right?
No.
So he burns away, his heart survives and is kept as a relic. What impact did it have? What impact did it have, let's just start locally, James, in terms of, did it have actually change anything in Vietnam at the time with the political context that you described?
Well, it did eventually, because the president was overthrown, but the immediate effect it had was turn even more Buddhists and I think ordinary Vietnamese, including Vietnamese that had been supporting of the president or at least not antagonistic. It did turn more Vietnamese against him, but he was, frankly, at that time, not particularly popular anyway. I think the bigger impact it had was worldwide. And that, again, is partly why I think he decided to do it in this way. So it wasn't just about the internal, it was more so about the external. And I think particularly the United States. I mean, they realized that the U.S. was involved in Vietnam and it seemed like would become more involved because of the communist threat. So what does happen is the U.S. really pulls its support from President Diem, and that leads to the coup and eventual assassination of the president not long afterwards. So it worked, you could say. It did have that impact. President Diem was gone and a new president was installed. And of course, the war ramps up and continues for the next 10 years or more. The protest, the self-immolation, was actually very effective in the result that happened.
It was very effective in America. I mean, as you mentioned, John Kennedy, JFK sort of describes it as one of the most important images and stuff. It didn't actually stop America getting involved in the Vietnam War, though, did it, in the end?
That was never the point. That's the interesting, almost, I don't know, paradox is the right word, but I mean, he was protesting, of course, the Vietnamese president who was anti-communist, but the monk, the Thích Quảng Đức, and the monks generally were not siding with the Viet Cong at all. And in fact, at some level, the protest was meant to spur the Americans to be involved in overthrowing President Diem. I think that's something that Thích Quảng Đức would see as a positive result.
As we said earlier, despite whatever the complex specific situation was that he was protesting against, this image does go on. And maybe it's been a bit more forgotten these days. And of course, we live in an age where there's, images of violence and death all around us on the internet. But at the time, there was nothing like that, was there? So it did become a symbol of the peace movement, maybe in a way that the image of Che Guevara in the 60s and 70s became an image for revolution. Thích Quảng Đức self-immolation in Saigon in 1963, of course, is one of the most extraordinary protest photographs ever taken. But here's a list of 10 other photographs from the countercultural era which had a huge impact on society. Number 1, Albert Korda's photograph of Che Guevara in 1960. This portrait is arguably the most reproduced photograph in history. Detached from its original political context, it became an emblem of youthful rebellion worldwide, appearing on t-shirts and bedroom walls around the world. Number 2, Bernie Boston's image of flower power at the Pentagon in 1967. A young demonstrator places a chrysanthemum into the barrels of soldiers' rifles during the march on the Pentagon. It distilled the ethos of non-violent resistance into one unforgettable image. There are several photographs from 1968, so number 3 in this list is the execution of Nguyen Van Lem. Also in Saigon is Eddie Adams' image of the instant when a South Vietnamese police chief executed a Viet Cong prisoner in the street. It was a photograph that shocked the world and complicated simplistic ideas of good and evil in the Vietnam War. Number 4 is the Black Power salute at the Mexico Olympics of 1968. A photograph taken by John Deminis shows Tommy Smith and John Carlos as they raised their gloved fists on the medal podium after winning their race. The image transcended sport and became synonymous with the civil rights struggle. Number 5, somewhat more peaceful, is William Anders' photograph Earthrise, taken during the Apollo 8 mission in 1968. It's not a protest photograph, but it's arguably the birth of the environmental consciousness movement. Seeing the Earth as a fragile blue sphere changed humanity's sense of itself. Well, at least a bit. And number 6, Lennon and Ono's Bed-In 1969. Those photographs from the two in Amsterdam and Montreal transform performance art into political theatre and peace protest. And what about number 7, Burke Uzzle's Woodstock Lovers image? You see a young couple wrapped in a blanket, lost in each other, the visual embodiment of the peace and love generation. Number 8 is John Fielo's image at Kate Stent University in 1970. We see Mary Ann Vecchio crying over the body of Jeffrey Miller, who's bleeding out after National Guardsmen opened fire on student protesters. It became an icon of the rupture between the American establishment and its own youth. Number 9 is Napalm Girl, Nick Utt's image from 1972. Perhaps the single most shocking anti-war photograph ever taken. It shows 9-year-old Phan Thi Kim Phuc running naked after an American napalm attack in Vietnam. The image transformed public opinion about the war. Number 10 is somewhat of a bonus, although outside the classic counter-cultural era. It's Tank Man from Beijing in 1989. An anonymous man stands before a whole column of tanks in Beijing. It's arguably the 20th century's greatest image of individual resistance to state power. These are images which, appeared on many bedroom walls, didn't they, across the Western world?
Yeah, and again, there's a bit of an irony there. The image itself is quite violent, even if it's self-directed rather than external. And that's where you get back into the Buddhist hesitancy to fully affirm this as a method of protest.
Let's dig into that, because there's a distinction, isn't there, in Buddhism between suicide, martyrdom, and self-sacrifice. As we said right at the top, you're not supposed to do this, are you? You're not supposed to be violent. You're not supposed to commit suicide. Despite these sort of incidents that you described earlier, that still is generally what we think about Buddhism, isn't it? It's a pacifist religion, right? So Tell us, James, is there the distinction between suicide and martyrdom and self-sacrifice?
Well, I think there can be, because so much of Buddhist ethics relies on intention. And this is where Thich Nhat Hanh, I haven't mentioned him yet, but of course Thich Nhat Hanh is after the Dalai Lama, probably the second most famous Buddhist until his recent passing a few years ago. Also, obviously Vietnamese. He was not in Vietnam at the time, I believe, but he's commented on the self-immolation. He's actually more sympathetic than the Dalai Lama. And his way of thinking about it is that the intention of Thích Quảng Đức was to raise awareness to the suffering of Buddhists in Vietnam at the time. And since intention is so important, that dissolves the other concerns of violence. And also because the violence, I think, for Thich Nhat Hanh is self-directed as opposed to, terrorism. We usually think of harming other people. So there is a precedent for that, thinking about intention. If your intention is pure and is about liberating beings from suffering, then again, the other rules kind of fall away, right? The problem, though, is that Buddhist ethics is not only about intention. There's also other elements. For example, you can intend to do something really kind and compassionate, but cause suffering anyway, because you haven't necessarily thought through the implications. All that is to say, there's a bit of a consequentialist element to Buddhist ethics. You can't actually dismiss entirely. For example, people have said that the problem with Thích Quảng Đức self-immolation is that it traumatized the people there, for example, and by extension, maybe anyone who sees the photo and is not prepared for that can create a kind of suffering just by looking at the image, which was not his intention, I don't think, but you could say maybe it was because he did want the image to maybe cause a change in people's perception.
Do we know what the response was from the people around him? The photographer, but also like the fellow monks and, the people that was kind of cooperating in this act.
There was, the eyewitnesses agree that it was almost eerily quiet. You could hear the flames and you could hear everything that was happening. And everyone was so focused on Thích Quảng Đức. And I think probably many of the monks were gathered around. You can see them in the photo in the background, actually behind the car that they arrived in. I often feel that they put the car too close to the flames. It's surprisingly close. But the monks are standing largely silent in the background. Some of them are weeping, though. And more so, I think the other sort of community members who are not monks, because there were obviously just Vietnamese citizens there too. So there is this kind of quiet lamentation, but it's deliberately held at a low key. So there's not screaming or what you might expect. And I think partly that's because they knew this was going to happen. At least most of the people there, it's not a shock to them because they've sort of come to this knowing that that something like this or this event is going to take place.
Just to sort of look into a little bit more why Buddhists would consider suicide to be wrong, I'm going to sort of throw a couple of case studies at you. I'm not asking you to sort of judge whether they're right or wrong, but it's just that they do illustrate that this is a sort of sliding scale, isn't it? I know of an old Buddhist man in India, actually part of a community, who he was sick and old and basically went off and committed suicide and left a note. I mean, much loved, by the way. But he basically did not want his family or his kids to have the responsibility of taking care of him and the cost involved in that. So that's an example of, you could say the intention then again is to do good. One very salty issue, I know it's already there in Canada, isn't it? Assisted suicide. I'm a libertarian. My view is that if I've decided that my life's done and I don't want to carry on with it, I've got the right to do that. But I don't think Buddhism would say that, would it?
Well, it wouldn't couch things in terms of rights. I think that's a kind of language that is tricky in traditional Buddhist or even modern Buddhist conceptions. I think in terms of euthanasia or doctor-assisted suicide, I think a lot hangs on the active versus passive element when you're talking about Buddhism. So what I mean by that is that if you cannot survive without life support, then that's totally. And I know many people will make that distinction as well. If there's an active ending of your life, let's say you're not particularly old, but you're going through immense suffering, that gets tricky because again, if you're suffering, the relief of suffering seems like something that Buddhists should be in support of. But on the other hand, this is complicated by rebirth as well. And I know most Western Buddhists don't really care or think much about rebirth, but in traditional Buddhism, rebirth is very important. So if you stop your life, what you're doing is you're just transforming to another level of being, let's say. And if you do that violently, you will probably drop down. So you're actually causing, in some ways, further suffering to your future self by this violent act of suicide. So I think Buddhists today struggle with doctor-assisted suicide. It's not a clear issue for them.
And it's a bit more simple, isn't it, when you think about, in the case we're talking about, he was a martyr, wasn't he? We have Christian martyrs, don't we? These are people who, rather than forego their own faith, they would rather be killed and often killed quite horrifically, right? But there's violence in that perpetrated by somebody else on the body. But he wasn't a martyr. You could say his intention, as you described it, was positive, to make things better for people. It's much more complicated, isn't it, with other types of suicide? Are we in despair, escaping? Are we deluded? Are we operating under delusion?
Yeah, that's, I think what people maybe miss sometimes within Buddhism is that not all suffering is equal, I guess is one way to put it. I mean, my students sometimes say that, hey, you have to give me an A in this class because otherwise I'll suffer.
Right.
But I think you're absolutely right. You can be deluded about your suffering. You can think you're suffering based on your addictions or, certain things. And the path to resolution is not to end your life. It's to resolve that form of addiction. That's at least the traditional Buddhist understanding. And that's partly why, again, suicide is considered wrong, is because it seems, at least in traditional Buddhism, like you're opting out of the opportunity to resolve the problem by just cutting it short. And then, of course, being reborn at some other level that's actually going to make it harder for you to achieve liberation. So at least that's the classical understanding. That's part of the reason why suicide was considered wrong.
What about for you? I mean, if you don't mind sort of sharing it, what's your own view on, say, you call it doctor-assisted suicide? Not just for somebody who's, say, like on life support or, for somebody who's terminally ill and in pain and they think, what, I just don't want to carry on. I mean, what's your view on that?
I mean, like you, I lean towards a libertarian perspective on that. But I do think, I guess my feeling is there ideally is a community of support that's able to help sort of process that. Because I guess my concern is that if someone is isolated and their decision to commit suicide is really out of kind of loneliness, and, that's understandable, but the solution is to build strong communities and to have a support network that allows someone to maybe continue to live through that support, right? And I know that sounds kind of, big scale, but I feel we're seeing that in the US and probably broadly in the West, maybe other countries as well, this real epic of loneliness, this real sense, maybe especially men, but I think people in general, many feel alienated from their life and their work. It is something that really is causing a lot of concern, I think, as it should.
But in your home country in Canada, it's actually been legalized, hasn't it? It's a lot of people have opted for it, haven't they?
Yes, including some people that I know. I have a good friend whose partner made that choice, and this was someone who was in her late 40s, early 50s, but was suffering pretty immense physical and I think mental pain. So in that case, I thought it was a completely justified and supportable decision.
Well, James, let's just return to Vietnam and other monks there do the same thing. And I mean, maybe you can take us through that and then through a sort of subsequent history of Buddhist self-immolation, because you mentioned Tibet earlier. And, that becomes an important part of this narrative too.
It is something that I think clearly was picked up by others in Vietnam from time to time. More recently, I think if we can shift a little bit to the Tibet situation, because I think that draws in some other elements as well, because this really only began, quite recently. I think 2009 is, I'm not aware, there could have been earlier cases in Tibet, and the number is quite staggering. I think it's more than 100, something like 150 Buddhists who have self-immolated in Tibet just in the past, 15, 16 years or so. So that's a quite astonishing number. And as you said, not all of them have gone in the way that Thích Quảng Đức. And we also don't have images for most of these. So it's, there's a little bit more of a mystery about them. And this is where, again, the Dalai Lama is interesting because he's been asked, of course, about this. And his response is, I think, much more ambivalent than Thich Nhat Hanh's was about Thích Quảng Đức. Now, granted, the scale is much bigger here when you're talking about 150 people. And I think at some level, the Dalai Lama doesn't want to encourage this as a practice. So the key, I think, about Thích Quảng Đức, he was a very advanced meditator. And even in the traditional stories, when you're talking about bodhisattvas or, figures doing these extreme acts, the key is that not everyone should do that. And I think that maybe this is becoming too widespread rather than something that only the very advanced meditators should do. So he's, his response has been, he admires the courage and the dedication, let's say. But I think the word that he uses, and he wants to stay neutral. He wants to kind of not even really talk about it, I think, as far as I can tell.
Or he tries to shift attention onto the causes, like, what's the context, why they're doing that. Maybe for anybody who doesn't know, you could just talk about that context as well.
Of course, the Chinese invasion of the Tibetan plateau in 1959 and the expulsion of the self-exile of the Dalai Lama since that time has caused a very significant issue and the deaths and destruction of a lot of Tibetan Buddhist culture in Tibet. And yeah, you're absolutely right that the Dalai Lama sees this as, you might say, unfortunate results of this tremendous form of suffering that has been imposed upon the Tibetan people by the Chinese occupation. So yeah, rather than focus on the actual self-immolation, he's talking about the causes that led to it and what needs to be done in order to resolve those causes, which again is a very classical Buddhist way of dealing with suffering, is not to focus on the results so much as the causes, try to undercut those causes. So in that way, he's being very traditional. I think he's feeling that tension of what self-immolation does within a Buddhist context, raises a lot of questions.
Yeah, I mean, he's always been very diplomatic as far as he's able as well, isn't he? And so I imagine that, he does not want to encourage young men or maybe young women to actually do this, and of course him sort of effectively, if he gave his approval in some way, then, it might start to actually spread, that more, the Dalai Lama thinks it's a good thing, therefore, we should do it. But just to talk a little bit about it, so it's 150, that's a lot of people. And of course, in a sense, the more people that do it, the less powerful it is as a theatrical performative act of protest, right? And you're saying that we don't know, much about that. It's not being filmed, it's not being photographed. And do we even know what the people who've done it the reasons that they've given for doing it?
I have to be honest, I haven't looked into this very far, but I'm not aware of much that has been written about this. It was actually, when I came across that number, I was quite astonished because I have heard, I remember in early 2010s, there was this sort of around the time of the Beijing Olympics, I think not uncoincidentally, but then the reporting kind of fell off, right? As things do, it's a new cycle. But clearly, this is something that has been continuing. And we don't, as far as I know, have much information, which, as you know, takes away the impact. I also want to say one more thing, and this is the Dalai Lama being very pragmatically political, is that he's also commented that he doesn't want to support this because he knows that the Chinese government will use this as a way of talking about how barbaric and regressive, the Tibetan people or Tibetan Buddhism is, that they would do something so horrific. And that actually, I can say that there are certain, I think, modern Buddhists who also feel that about self-immolation, that there's something they don't like about it because it seems so not just extreme, but very not a rational thing to do, like something that buried in the past somehow. And the Dalai Lama feels that the Chinese government would use that against Tibet, which is true.
This is a sidebar about the history of self-immolation in the counterculture and in the years since. Thích Quảng Đức self-immolation in Saigon in 1963 established one of the most enduring images of political protest, as we've been discussing. But in the years that followed, others turned to the same terrible act. In 1968, the Polish accountant Ryszard Siwek set himself alight during a state harvest festival in Warsaw to protest the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia. A few months later, in January 1969, the Czech philosophy student Jan Palach set himself on fire in Prague's Wenceslas Square to awaken his country from what he saw as political resignation after the Soviet invasion. His funeral became a vast public demonstration of grief and resistance. Only weeks later, fellow student Jan Zajic followed his example. He was only 18, and he believed that Jan Palach's warning had gone unheeded. He left letters urging his fellow citizens not to surrender to fear and conformity before taking his own life in an act of political protest. In 1972, the American artist and anti-war activist Zalman Hendler set himself on fire outside the United Nations in New York in protest against the Vietnam War, although his action received relatively little public attention. In 1989, the Romanian electrician Liviu Babes self-immolated on a ski slope in Brasov in protest against Nicolae Ceausescu's dictatorship, shortly before the Romanian Revolution. In December 2010, in the Tunisian town of Sidi Bouzid, Mohamed Bouzazizi, a 26-year-old street vendor, had endured years of harassment from local officials. After police confiscated his produce and, according to many accounts, humiliated him in public, his attempts to seek justice were ignored. In desperation, he set himself on fire outside the regional governor's office. His death became the catalyst for mass demonstrations across Tunisia, toppling the government within weeks and helping to ignite the wave of uprisings that became known as the Arab Spring. And as recently as 2022, Win Bruce, a climate activist and longtime Zen Buddhist practitioner, died after self-immolating outside the United States Supreme Court on Earth Day in what many interpreted as an act of desperate witness to the climate crisis. And in 2024, Max Azzarello self-immolated outside the Manhattan courthouse during Donald Trump's criminal trial after distributing a manifesto expressing his belief that society was trapped in a web of political and technological corruption. These acts arose from very different cultures, political systems, and personal circumstances. Some were rooted in religious traditions, others were entirely secular, some possibly the result of mental health issues. Yet all shared a common conviction that when every other avenue of protest had been closed, a single act might awaken the conscience of a sleeping people. Whether viewed as martyrdom, moral witness, or tragic desperation, they continue to raise questions about the limits of political resistance, the ethics of self-sacrifice, and the extraordinary power that a single human being can sometimes exert over the course of history. In your research, have you come across, even in Japan or in other Buddhist cultures, other acts of kind of what we'd call self-harm, for various reasons?
There isn't a lot of it in Japan. Maybe the closest that I'm aware of in Japan is there's a mountain outside of Kyoto called Hiezan, which is one of the great Buddhist mountains in Japanese history. And there's a practice that Japanese monks on this mountain would do where they would run up and down the mountain every day for 100 days. So it was this kind of cycle. And it's, it's not Mount Everest, but it's a full day run if you try to, go up and down it. So it was a pretty intense ascetic practice. And then during this practice, they would spend 9 days, I think it was, trying to go without food, without water, and without sleep. As you might imagine, many of them died. I think when you talk about those three things, I mean, food, 9 days, sure. Water, that's a little close. But sleep, to go 9 days without sleep, that's almost impossible for human beings to do. So that's an example of where this practice became so extreme that even though it wasn't anything like the spectacle, I mean, this was done up in the mountain hundreds of years ago mostly, but the authorities eventually found this was a little too much. They didn't want their monks just, doing this and then dying. But that's probably the closest that I know of. There are other examples maybe you could think of in Japan.
Let's talk about some of your other areas of interest, staying with Buddhism, but using it in a sense as a lens at which to look at, say, the peace movement, during the counterculture and since, Can violence ever be justified in Buddhism?
Well, I think it can. And one answer to that question is that there have been Buddhists who have committed violence, not just against themselves, but against other people. I'm not really in support of most of those instances, but all that is to say, and this is something I try to do in my work, is to show that Buddhism has always been politically involved, very often on the side of the political elites and the status quo. So it's, Buddhist politics has traditionally been quite conservative, and as a result of that has engaged in violence, often in the form of state oppression, let's say. But there are others, and the folks that I try to focus on in my work are the Buddhists who are involved in resistance movements of some form, including in Japan in the early 20th century. And the question of violence always comes up because it's a hard one, like self-immolation, maybe even more so, because if you're talking about violence against others, that seems like in Buddhist terms, that's another level than violence against your own being. And so, the Buddhist resistors, they struggle with this. And the person that I focus on, Seno Giro, who's a really interesting Buddhist socialist from the early 20th century, his resolution or his way of kind of thinking this through was that he had to work closely with secular revolutionaries in order to make sure that they minimized as much as possible the kind of violence that they carried out, even if some of it might actually have to happen simply because the systems were so violent that breaking them down would lead to some, you might say some friction or some violence as a result of that. So he sort of saw his role as the minimizer, and he and his Buddhist socialists would help with the revolutionaries to make sure that, for example, after the revolution, there wasn't large-scale purges of the defeated and so on. So it was always a difficult question, but I think using some of the same texts that we talked about before, there's always this loophole that says if you're living under a repressive system that is causing immense suffering, the liberation or the transformation of that system outweighs the small-scale forms of violence that might actually have to take place for that to happen, which is dangerous, right? Because that could be a slippery slope.
Right. You say violence is permitted to prevent worse violence, for instance, right? But that is definitely a slippery slope. And so in countries where Buddhism has become effectively the state religion, let's Sri Lanka or Myanmar, Burma as it was, where effectively the Buddhist churches of those countries have been on the same side as the government. Well, we've seen, I'm not sure about Sri Lanka, but there's been a lot of criticism, wasn't there, in Myanmar, that this kind of Buddhist community was in some way complicit against the violence which was perpetrated on the Rohingya, right? Mm-hmm. Either by staying silent and not condemning it, or possibly worse, possibly in some way participating.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think Sri Lanka in some ways is the bellwether, let's say, for that. I mean, they, early on when the Sri Lankan Civil War, the treatment of the Tamils was often justified and supported by the Buddhist community. That's a very good example of where religion, including Buddhism, becomes really an identity, and even a national identity, an ethnic identity, more than a series of teachings about, let's say, suffering and compassion. Mm. And if I can bring that back to my guy, Seno again in Japan, what he saw in Japan in the 1930s was something very similar, that the Buddhist institutions were supporting the Japanese imperial expansion in Asia on the basis of this idea that, Asia was Buddhist and they needed Japan to be in control because otherwise the Western countries would colonize, which is not incorrect. So that part of it was probably right. But, his pushback against that was Buddhism for the Japanese shouldn't be a Pan-Asian identity. It should be a set of principles about compassion and suffering. And if that's the case, there's no justification for imperialist warfare. That to him seemed absurd, but he was shocked by the fact that so many Buddhists were okay with it.
Right, and it becomes institutionalized, so you can't separate it out from the kind of power structures. But what you were referring to earlier, I suppose, was more when Buddhists or Buddhist communities have been, as it were, outside of, you might call it revolution, or you might call it, resistance to sort of state violence. And I guess the Dalai Lama, for most of us, kind of represents that in some way, doesn't it? That he has walked this very peaceful line, despite the fact that his own culture has been, eradicated to a large extent, and people are still suffering in Tibet, right? But and Thich Nhat Hanh too, maybe even more so, right? Because coming from a war-torn country, but effectively preaching a message of peace and forgiveness and reconciliation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's no surprise that those two figures became the two most famous Buddhists in the world, not of their own choosing, but because of the situation that happened to both. The Dalai Lama is particularly interesting, I think, because he has said, and I think I agree with him, that as much suffering as was caused by the Chinese invasion, in some ways it was not a good thing, but it did, it did help the Tibetan Buddhist community kind of rethink and maybe himself rethink what it was they were trying to do, and obviously gave him a much more global, place to do that. But I think what he meant by that is something that the Chinese had always said, and he was kind of admitting was true, is that when the Chinese invaded Tibet, Tibet was a theocracy. It was a very conservative society where people, again, I don't want to talk too much about rights here, but people really didn't have a lot of freedom, or, it was not a flourishing place, let's say. And although that doesn't justify what the Chinese did, in some ways, the Dalai Lama was admitting, I think, that Tibet should have changed internally and hadn't until the invasion sort of forced it to rethink.
Yeah, I mean, it was a kind of feudal, sort of medieval, quite brutal place in many ways, wasn't it? And of course, consequences for once in the positive direction, that did end up spreading Tibetan Buddhism throughout the world, didn't it, as well, which is, so it became a kind of gift to the world. Just to return to, the image that we started with, how did that image, the photograph, the act of self-immolation, did you think it changed people's impressions of what Buddhism was in the West? And in a way maybe attracted people to Buddhism during those kind of subsequent countercultural years?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting question. I hadn't thought so much about it, but it is certainly true that the 1960s, even in the early 1950s, but starting in the late 50s and early 60s, you do have this movement of Buddhism in the West. I mean, folks like D.T. Suzuki, of course, are really on the forefront of that. You have the Beat Generation, picking up on a lot of this. And I think there definitely was a sense that this is an interesting, intriguing religion that is somehow connected to mental power and these kind of ability to do something, even if that's maybe an extreme example. But I think also the political connection, because the folks who were intrigued by Buddhism in the 50s and 60s tended to be those who were already part of the counterculture or who were sort of leaning towards those. So they took that image, maybe misinterpreted it or reinterpreted it in a way to sort of inspire or think about Buddhist practice more generally. So I think it certainly did play a role. I don't want to put too much emphasis on it because you have also all these books being written in the early 60s by Buddhists in Asia and also in the West as well.
I suppose it inspired the notion of self-sacrifice, that one could, the sort of ultimate gift in a way for the sake of a greater cause. But also, I think there was something intriguing about the idea of developing such, mental powers that you could kind of overcome such amount of pain, Do you think that Buddhists should be more engaged? It's a religion or a philosophy or a way of living that emphasizes self-reflection, maybe looking inwards, spending time on retreat, spending time each day meditating, and that has a power, and it has a power particularly on individuals. For you, should that power be turned much more outwards into community action and activism, and particularly in a time when we've got an environmental crisis and the world is as ever in a terrible mess?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the problems that Buddhism has, maybe especially today, but to some extent, maybe always, is that the focus on the internal sometimes will be at the expense of not just the external, but what I would call the structural. And we're living, the world has always been interdependent, and Buddhists have always understood that. But I think we're living in a world where things like climate change, I mean, no matter how much I do in my personal life, we might be beyond the point of changing it anyway. But I think without that solidarity, without that activism, we can't resolve the really big things that are pressing upon us. Even things like the epidemic of loneliness, I think that's not going to be solved by individuals. That has to be group efforts. And I think Buddhism has a lot to say to that. And part of what I want to do in my work is bring out that broader structural element. Engaged Buddhism does it sometimes, but I think there could be even more of it.
So engaged Buddhism would be, yes, it is important to self-reflect. It is important to meditate. It is important, if you like, to spend time in practices which actually have a direct impact, positive impact on your own mind. But the lesson throughout the 70s and 80s of the kind of self-help movements and the wellness movements was that journey only takes you so far. And I mean, I'm always intrigued by this thing which Carl Jung said, which was something like, the problems of the first half of life are not the problems of the second half of life. And the solutions to the problems of first half of life aren't the solutions to the problems of the second half of life. And what he basically meant was, I think, was that, yes, it's important, to spend time on, let's call it self-development, individuation, but you can't solve the problem of the self by yourself. That those problems are solved in community.
No, that's absolutely right. And again, I think Buddhism has always understood that by questioning the individual self and by situating the self within networks of relationships. So I think that's something that can be really extended and expanded even more.
I mean, and sort of finally, in this era, we're saturated with images and social media. And do you think an act of self-sacrifice could still carry that kind of moral force? Or was that sort of a unique moment in history, do you think, at the time?
I think it was, and partly because of the fracturing of our media today. I mean, as you know, not everyone is reading Time Life or these magazines or even television that would have this extremely wide audience. That just doesn't exist so much anymore. Now, that's not to say that things don't go viral. Obviously, they do. But I really don't think, for a lot of reasons. One, we're living at a much more sort of jaded, let's say, time where we've seen so many images of violence, both real and now, of course, AI. Well, that's an issue. If something like that happened today, the first thought would be, this is an AI image, right? I mean, even when I look at this picture, right, it's like, wow, that looks like an AI image because it's so hard to believe. And of course, no one would believe it. So that's also another element that would make it much less likely today.
James, thanks so much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
It was my pleasure.
Thanks very much to James. You may have possibly found this, as I did, a slightly grim episode in one way, but in another way, of course, absolutely fascinating. I was very interested to touch, amongst other things, on the subject of assisted suicide, which there are two types: physician-assisted suicide, in which a doctor prescribes medication that the patient self-administers, and euthanasia, in which the clinician administers the life-ending medication. Different countries permit one, the other, or both. That's not really a typical Bureau of Lost Culture subject, of course, but it does touch on the area of personal liberty. France has just passed a law moving towards legalising assisted dying to some extent, and we were sort of on the way here too in the UK recently, until it got blocked by the House of Lords. I'm a libertarian. I don't generally believe any government has the right to legislate what I choose to do with my body, including ending my life. But I also see this can be problematic, and we've all got possibly strong opinions one way or the other on it. What do you think? Let me know. And is this the sort of thing we should talk about more? That image of Thích Quảng Đức is extraordinary. And I put a gallery of the top 10 images I mentioned in the sidebar at our Patreon site. Come and have a look. Join us if you like. bureauoflostculture.com. Don't self-immolate, no matter how strongly you feel about something. In these days of widespread violent imagery on the internet, it probably just go unnoticed. But let's keep listening. Thanks for listening. I hope to see you further down the road, over the hillsides and round the bend, for more of these tales from the other side.